Assalamu alaikum and welcome to In Conversation With. Today I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Osman Latiff, a historian and scholar with expertise in Crusader studies, Islamic history and the role of religious poetry during the Crusades. His acclaimed works including The Cutting Edge of the Poet's Sword and On Being Human explore themes like Muslim poetic resistance, coexistence and the fight against dehumanization. A dynamic lecturer and author, Dr. Latiff's diverse research spans Arab-US relations and historical fiction with his latest novel, Shadows of Strangers, set during the Spanish Inquisition. Dr. Osman, welcome to the show.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Now, Dr. Osman, I was reading your intro there, and you've got your undergrad, you've got your MA, you've got your PhD, and I'm sure you've studied non-stop ever since then as well, because education, of course, never stops. Now, I stopped at undergrad. I was like, 10,000 word dissertation, I'm done. So tell me, where did the inspiration come from you wanting to study these topics, these very complex topics, in such detail?
I think first we say, Bismillah, Muhammad, that all inspiration is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All success is from Him. And all goodness that we achieve in life is alone for Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the beginning point, for the Muslim. I think for me, that growing up, I think one of the big influences for my life, of course, was my parental backing. Parents pushing me to keep on going. And I think having that mantra in life, motto in life, to keep on trying is very key. I always felt that after my, let's say, for example, after my degree, you mentioned doing a degree, I felt there was a need to further explore a particular study in Crusades that's underrepresented. I think Muslims are doing it less. I think it's overrepresented by, let's say, a study of the Latin side, but not the Arabic Muslim side. And that kind of became a drive for me. When I was in Syria for a short time in 2001, my teacher believed that doing history was fard kifaya. It was an obligation by sufficiency that some people had to study history. And because we have so many people, of course, for very good reasons, excelling in engineering and medicine and other things, maybe there's less of a contribution on the humanities. And I really felt that I could play a role in this. So I think that parental backing, of course, tawfiq from Allah, and having just the drive to further developing my skills as a historian.
Now, you mentioned the Crusades there. The Crusades were, a monumental part of history. For those who might not be familiar with what the Crusades was or what happened, could you give us a bit of a brief history?
Yeah, so there's kind of like specifics to the brief history as well. Because remember that Christendom was having its own problems at the same time. And it wanted to, in papal reforms, and it wanted to think of a novel way of preventing people having punishment in the grave, for example, and in purgatory. And so the way to do this was to take up arms or to go on pilgrimage. And so at the same time when the Crusade was preached, that belief system filtered through into people's minds. So one, of course, you had Christendom, and of course, you had the Catholic Church fighting against the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it was about who kind of like has the bigger role to play, the Emperor or the Pope in announcing a war. The Catholics had it so that the Pope announced the war, the Crusade, and it was the Pope rather than the Emperor doing this, and it kind of gave credence to the papacy to be able to do that rather than the Emperor, as the Eastern Orthodox Church would believe. That's one. Number two, of course, is a very dehumanized image of the Muslims presented in the accounts of the First Crusade, particularly in the letters of Ibn II. Muslims are Moors, Turkish, barbaric, backwards, savage, darker-skinned, pagans, And so for people who had blood on their hands, who were like thieves and brigands and murderers, it gave them a chance of salvation if they're going to fight against such savage people across, and also pillaging, messing up Jerusalem, which is the most important place for Christians, and fighting against them was a noble cause. So that's number two. And number three, of course, there was stagnation and weakness in the Muslim Ummah at the time because of inner conflict, and that division kind of didn't help the Muslim recovery was at the advantage of the Crusades, because they played on that division, and then soon enough they came and they took Jerusalem. And the Crusade was announced in 95, was preached in 99. They came and they committed a massacre in Jerusalem, and they took Jerusalem. That became the first Crusade.
Now, what role do you think the fact that the Muslims are disunited, for the longest period, Muslims have been disunited. There has been political turmoil in the Middle East, and of course, there's different roles of that. You've wrote about the U.S. involvement, but domestically within the Middle East, right? Because they're so disunited, do you feel like that has had? Why do you think that basically what I'm trying to say is, why do you think that disunity has taken place, and why have the Muslims not been more united? Because when we're together, we're a lot stronger, but when we're divided, it allows for things like history to be rewritten, and for this idea that Muslims are X, Y, and Z to take place, because we're not in it together. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. Well, there is, of course, a Quranic instruction here about not being divided, about being united. And the Battle of Uhud was, of course, a reminder for them that if they fall to division, they become weak. And the hadith, it says that division is a punishment and unity is rahmah. So when you're divided, you're weak and you're prone to infighting and divisiveness and argumentation, and that's inner weakness, but it's also strength for the enemy. Our situation today, without the Khilafah, the Islamic State, of course, we don't have the leadership of the Ummah, or a single army or a single Baytul Mal. We don't have these things. But remember that Crusades happened at a time where you had the Islamic State functioning, for sure, but you didn't always have the Caliphs like big interest in repelling the Crusaders, because there's other conflicts, other things to worry about in Baghdad and this and that. And so Muslims, for example, in the first few decades, in response to the Crusades, it's not always political. It was by the lay people. It was scholars and poets, litterateurs and people of adab writing poems and writing things against the Crusaders to kind of re-inspire the Muslims to feel a sense of resistance against the Crusaders, at least in that time. So I think that...
Can I just ask you about that? So how did, especially poetry, because especially these days, we see poetry as this, it's like rhymes, right? This is what we're taught in school, it's rhymes. But back then, poetry was a form of resistance. So how did it play a role?
It was the media. It was the media at the time. It was the media at the time, because people would gather and hear poets. So you didn't have like all the stuff that you have today. You had some people excelling in poetry, and they would either work for their patron, and they're getting paid for the job they're doing in creating verse to celebrate the ruler's achievements, for example. Or you had civilian poets, refugee poets, like who were kicked out of their homeland, had an axe to grind because they wanted to come back to their homeland, and then therefore that became the incentive for them to write the poetry. But poetry was one. Number two, it was scholars like Ali ibn Tariq al-Sulami wrote the first book against the first crusade, Kitab al-Jihad. You had people of adab literature in different forms and fields. You had people excelling in inscriptions, writing messages on walls or on mosques, for example. And that became, again, because it's visual, a form of media for them. But poetry is unique because poetry was the most rousing literary vehicle against the Crusaders. It was what really garnered the spirits. And it's like, for example, when Arabs hear poetry being recited, maybe unlike us because we don't have the appreciation, they become moved by the poetry. They become moved and becomes tearful. And poets, therefore, compose verses that had those different emotions embedded in the lyrics. And as well, because you have poetry that's changing over time. So, for example, if you take the first 4 decades, it was more about internal blame, and you got to fix up your mess, and division is a weakness, and appealing for the Khalif. But then after Imad ad-Din Zengi retook Edessa, the Crusader state, he had poetry then change towards fight the struggle, the jihad against the Crusaders and liberate Jerusalem. And so it changes over time depending on the situation that they're facing.
Now, before our conversation started, we had a brief discussion on something that I really find interesting is the fact that in this day and age, if you ask anyone who's under the age of 14, 15, you ask them, what do they want to be when they're older? They say influencer, YouTuber, etc., etc. Now, you did. I was reading an article where you spoke about this almost idealization of celebrities. What sort of impact is that going to have in the long term, especially for our Muslim viewers, if their children aspire to be influencers, celebrities, TikTokers, etc.? What sort of long term impact is that going to have on the world and in particular the Muslim Ummah?
So if I remember, one thing I said in the article was the fact that the etymology of image is from imitatio. It goes back to that. So an imitation. So by the way, so image comes from imitation,
Okay.
imitare. So you can see the link there. That people tend to copy what they're seeing, and if they like what they're seeing, they're going to copy it, like the hairstyle or the fashion or the clothing. Islam is built more upon the ideal rather than the image. So the prophetic call was upon, like for example, the man that was in Mecca, he began to shake when he saw the Prophet because he was in awe of his image, of who he was. And the Prophet says to him, Hawin alayk, like relax yourself because I'm not a king. I'm the son of a woman from Quraysh who used to eat dried meat on the floor. And teaching him, although he had the best image, he was teaching the man that we've come to transform your ideals as a people, and not to commit murder, to bury your children alive, to believe in Allah alone, and so on and so forth. And I think that there is a superficiality in image projection, and it's always been like that. So, for example, if you look in the time of the Romans, for example, the one who was deified was the Roman emperor. The Roman emperor was seen as the Levi Filius. He was the son of a god, like Augustine, like Julius Caesar. And the best way to make yourself famous was either by owning something the emperor owned, or by touching the emperor. It's like today, for example. So either you own,
like take a photo with a celebrity, and you post it on your Instagram.
You own like a toothbrush you once used once in his life, and then becomes so expensive, and you become famous. It's validation over that. Or you touch the celebrity, like once you've touched him, I touched him once in my life, that becomes your status, and it's very similar, like from then to now.
Yeah.
Whereas in Islam we don't have that. We don't have that. We have, for example, in the Prophet's time, the people who were the least acknowledged were the most elevated. So, for example, the example of Julaybib, who was the Prophet's companion, who was Jalbab, who was like very small, and people didn't keep company with him. But when he was martyred, the Prophet says to him, the Prophet said, "Hada minni wa ana minhu," this man is from me and I am from him, 3 times, to show therefore that we don't look at the outer of a person, it's the inner of a person. And I think that that's really crucial for us as parents to mention a lot, because our kids are suffering. Our girls will suffer in school because they can't keep up to those false standards of greatness or goodness. They can't keep up with that. Whereas if you emphasize that that's not what makes you inherently great in the first place, it's about your character, your words, your kindness.
But how do you do that? Because you said, Islam, we don't have that. But in the Muslim communities, that it is there, where you do have these young, very impressionable people, even older people who aspire to be X, Y, and Z. So how do you prevent that? How do you teach them
the
Islamic way?
What I try and emphasize is, number one, the limitation in time of all those things. It's called the Kleenex phase or the Kleenex age of fame, by Neil Gable, I think he called it that. Whereas, for example, it's like you clean your nose with it, then you cast it aside. And it's like everyone has a very short shelf life. Yeah. So, for example, like if you remember some names of the 1980s and 90s when we were growing up, maybe they're not as famous as they are now because they're different people. And so it's always transitioning like that. You always have the old ones cast aside, the new ones come in, because your beauty you don't have all the time, nor your talent you have all the time. And it's always changing. So Allah in the Quran says, like for example, you have this very powerful verse about when Ibrahim a.s. was teaching his people about Tawheed. And Allah says that when he saw the moon, and he says, هذا ربي, this is my Lord, because he's giving dawah to his people. فَلَمَّا أَفَلَ, and when the moon disappeared, no, sorry, it sort of stars first, when they disappeared, he said, I don't worship things that disappear. Then the moon came, and the same thing happened, and the sun came. He said, this must be my Lord, the big one. And then it disappeared because the night came. So everything has a limitation that people aspire to. Whereas Allah, of course, Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum, Allah has no limitation like that. And so I think that moving people away from things that are limited, by showing people that your sense of worth that makes you inherently happier as a person is not built upon standards that are superficial, that change over time. Because what if when you don't have them? Does that mean you become sad because you don't have them? No. What is lasting is that you maintain your sense of ideals, and that in following Allah, following His Prophet, those things keep a person happy. And of course, Allah in the Quran is saying that indeed in Allah's remembrance, hearts find contentment. Of course, if Allah is saying, of course, in that verse, that Allah's remembrance, hearts find contentment. Allah knows the inner of a person. So I could, for example, put on a false veneer of something, yeah. But is that giving me the best happiness inside me? It's not. You see, like for example, you can find a person who might have everything in life, but still resorts to other stimuli like drugs and alcohol because he wants something additional to that. So it's not just the like having a lot of glamour and money that's going to keep people happy. If Allah is saying it's Allah's remembrance that makes people happier, that means there is a metaphysical thing happening that we're not alert to. That means the human being is not just the flesh, that we're a soul, and we're a heart, we're limbs, we're all this together, and Allah made us like that. So Allah knows what's best for us in all situations. So if, for example, my inner being, my inner self, Allah is saying, remember Allah more, you'll find happiness in that. That means that's the way forward. Whereas other things might be superficially like give you a sense of like small moment of gratification, but it's not lasting. Now that's not to say, the hadith that says Allah is beautiful, loves what is beautiful. So it doesn't say that we don't try to be beautiful in our appearance, whatever, but we don't make that a life goal for ourselves.
So how do you get to a point then where you can put that trust in Allah, if that makes sense? You know, in the sense that, you know, if you had an exam, for example, you'll revise for the exam because you want to do well, right? Mm. Or you will save money because you want to get a house because that means you'll be more secure in the future. How do you get to the point where you can go, whatever will be Allah's will?
Look at Gaza. You look at Gaza. And I think Gaza has tilted the axis of the world in some ways. And I think because now, like when we look towards Gaza and its people, and we say, it's almost like endurance, patience, resistance, willpower. We say, how are they doing it over there? And how will they respond to that situation over there, for example? Yeah. And I think that becomes a very important, almost like a living case study for us to reflect back on the people of Gaza. So one, of course, is to know, of course, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not just Allah. We don't have life that we're only seeing from the lens of that's dunyawi, that's only like in this life. If that was the case, then all the things that people might assume to be great might be great because it's limited to this life, but it's not. If you're seeing success in life, meaning success in this life and the next life, that means it's holistic. That means that your existence is not bound by a temporality of this life. It has a far greater consequence. And it could be that things that you do today might compromise that tomorrow, or it might be vice versa. Things that you do today might facilitate and harness and better situation tomorrow. So I think that having that perspective that it's not just for now, it's also for tomorrow, means that I would be far more keen about investing my time, my effort, my resource, my money, for example, in giving charity or whatever, looking after my family, because I'm concerned about tomorrow's day. And all of us, of course, are limited in time. We don't live forever. We have a short life. And so think about what will happen once a person dies. Now, of course, in that situation, what are we reminded of? We're reminded that, O people, kullukum min Adam all of your Adam was from dust. So we go back to our base state. We take nothing with us. When a person dies, for example, he has nothing. He has no designer belt, no designer clothes, and nothing. All of his fame is stripped from him. This is why, for example, there's a cemetery called Hollywood Forever in America.
Right.
If it's still there, I think it's still there. And what happens is that it's all like famous people are buried there. Yeah, in the It's for, yeah. But the thing is, if you want to, like, for example, like they're all in crypts, yeah. But so what happens? It has like these things that if you want to know who's there, you press the play button, and it kind of an image comes up, a video or a song of that dead person. It's almost like the idea that people, you haven't died fully as yet. Yeah. But they don't think they died. They're still living because that memory of that person. But the person's dead. His bones and he's gone, his soul is gone. Whereas in Islam, we recognize the fact that we do die. We do die. And everything in life is very purposeful, because in the Quran, for example, we have this لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ, which is a repeated motif in the Quran at the end of many verses in the Quran, that perhaps you would return to Allah. So all things in life, whether you're ill, whether you're happy, healthy, sick, triumph, whether you have a loss, everything is solely for the purpose that perhaps you return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah therefore gives you an opening. I might not see the opening, I might reject the opening, but it's there for my taking. So it could be, for example, a person has a loss in something, but from that loss makes him more cognizant of his temporality, of his life, of his time, of his commitments, whatever. Make him less heedless, for example, or vice versa. A person could have a lot of good in life, and that might make him cognizant of the fact that I'm thankful to Allah for Allah. Like Sulaiman, like Prophet Sulaiman in the Quran. Prophet Sulaiman had, of course, all these splendors and all these wealth, but it made him realize to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think that, but then again, there are, of course, other things as well, like a person's keeping good company, a person being close to the masjid, a person doing his morning, evening azkar, praying for, all these things can help a person's spiritual stance, his heart grow, and then become more inclined towards Allah. Whereas if you keep yourself in bad company, bad friends, bad social media, bad influences, bad epistemology, bad learning, then your heart will go down and your nafs will become elevated, and that's the worst state to be in.
Now, I mean, there's so much more that I'd love to talk to you about, but we've got less than a minute. So in 30 seconds, could you share where can people find your work? Where can people find out more about what you're doing?
That time went really fast.
I know, it went rapid.
Subhanallah.
Subhanallah,
That's like the essence of things.
See, when you enjoy yourself, that's what happens. But now you've only got 15 seconds to plug yourself.
Yeah, so I work for Sapience Institute, so you can find my work on Sapience Institute. My books and my articles are there. We encourage a world that is convinced of Islam by training people to become knowledgeable in Islam and push back against academic challenges against Islam. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook as well, inshallah. So.
Inshallah. See, there you go. All the handles. Make sure you go follow Dr. Osman. Make sure you go purchase his book as well, including his new novel, Shadows of Strangers, set during the Spanish Inquisition. It's been a great conversation. We covered loads of ground there, and inshallah we can get you on very soon. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you viewers for watching In Conversation With. I've been Tariq Ahmed. Assalamu alaikum.